Самому мейнстриму современной науки о религии, который, я думаю, интересно всем, и тем, кто занимается и теологией, и философией религии, и наукой о религии. Благодарю всех присутствующих. Позвольте предоставить слово уважаемому профессору.
I'm very sorry I can't address you in Russian. I'm afraid my education was in dead languages, in Latin and ancient Greek, and so that's where I stopped. So, but I will try and leave plenty of room for discussion as well. But thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great joy for me to be here. I've never been to Russia before. I've always wanted to come. And above all, I wanted to come to St. Petersburg, and now I'm here. So thank you very much indeed. Is religion natural? Is a predisposition, at least, to religious belief written in some way into human nature? A whole new academic discipline, the cognitive science of religion, has recently been developed to examine this. Growing out of current understandings in cognitive science, building on the insights of psychology and anthropology, it has looked at how the cognitive architecture of the human mind predisposes us to think about the world in religious ways. One important insight is that religion is a universal characteristic. All human societies have it. Anthropologists, even those who themselves are atheists, are very well aware that any ancient society they literally unearth will have had a shared religion, even if there are no visible temples or shrines left. Similarly, psychologists find the building blocks of a religious understanding in the way that people see the world, and that is at its most apparent in young children, infants even. Now, over the last few years, I have myself been involved as a philosopher, and that's my training, in directing a research project in Oxford in both empirical work and philosophical reflection, and looking at their implications. What, if anything, do the results of what is an ongoing research program actually prove? Now, arguments will rage as to whether the fact, and it does seem to be that humans have an inbuilt bias to religious understandings, tell us anything about the truth of a religion. Might it even be the case that if we can give evolutionary explanations for typical religious views, we have in effect explained them away? Science has shown why we hold them or are attracted by them, but we can view them as merely irritating byproducts of the development under evolutionary pressure of human cognitive architecture. This is the line taken by the atheist evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. He concedes that a form of natural selection, coupled with the fundamental uniformity of human psychology, sees to it that the diverse religions share significant features in common. He gives us an example of belief in life after death, which he does accept is subjectively appealing. In his own words, we are psychologically primed for religion. Nevertheless, he clearly believes this is an infantile approach to the world that we should, if we are rational, grow out of. The significant point is that he is in effect conceding that humans are naturally religious. That's the default option. Cognitive scientists would qualify this last assertion. They would say that, as one writer puts it, natural cognitive systems develop in ways that make people thoroughly receptive to religions, to their myths, to their rituals, and to their representations. In other words, we're not born believing, but as we develop, we find religious beliefs easy to latch onto. In the same way, we may not already be born with a language, but we are primed to pick up whatever language is being spoken around us. That in turn implies that the nature of languages and of religions will themselves be likely to be constrained by what is acceptable to human cognition. The consequence is that, as the same writer says, it is atheism, not religion, that humans must work to acquire. So atheism is unnatural, religion is natural. Indeed, as the same writer points out, science itself is often much more implausible to initial human understanding than ordinary religious views. For example, it teaches us that apparently solid objects are far from solid. They're composed of myriad particles. Yet all these arguments impinge on very venerable ones about how far any characteristics can be innate, born in us, about the respective contributions of genes and environment, of biology and society. Our growing understanding of the importance of the human genome in influencing human character and behaviour should not blind us to the fact that very few qualities are entirely dependent on our genes, on our heredity alone. Eye colour, skin colour might be examples, but for the most part, human development comes from a subtle interplay between genes and environment, let alone issues about free will. Even the migration of birds has to be triggered by external factors. Drop in temperature. So just because of the undoubted influence of external circumstances on human behaviour, not to mention that of animals, it is easy to think that in the human case, social differences, social influences, provide a full explanation of why we act as we do. This tendency is reinforced when such actions vary considerably in time and place. It would seem reasonable to assume that the human genotype is not going to explain differences between human societies if it's assumed to be fairly constant, yet human societies are different. And that has, of course, been the working assumption of sociology for the last 50 years, albeit one that's being increasingly challenged. So sociology wants to explain difference, not similarity. And sociologists, in perhaps an example of academic imperialism, have wanted to claim that social explanations are sufficient to explain humanity, indeed perhaps all human behaviour, in all its multifaceted variety. Now this attitude lingers on, even in the face of the new scientific research, like the cognitive science of religion, which appears to cast doubt on it. David Martin, for instance, who was speaking in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, a renowned sociologist of religion, whose work began in the 1960s, very eminent sociologist, still betrays, I think, the assumptions of that generation of 50 years ago, explicitly dealing with new research in the cognitive science of religion. He continues to assert the priority of the social as a source of explanation. At first sight, he may appear to have right on his side. Religions do come in many shapes and sizes. Religions are different from each other. And sometimes the differences seem to be the most important thing about them. It might appear that one form of explanation is not going to fit them all. How could one single explanation explain all the differences, the pluralities of the differences? Do we not need to turn to social differences themselves for that? The question is, if religion is grounded in human nature, is not a uniform human nature going to produce a uniform religion? One human nature, one religion. Why not? It could provide a single explanation to fit every case, but the point is it would have to be put at such a level of generality as to be virtually useless as a form of explanation. It could certainly, it seems, only hope to explain underlying similarities, not, it's alleged, the real and important differences. That is what Martin argues, pointing out that, say, an evolutionary constant could not account for the variable presence and absence of religion. He further argues, and this is what he says, Christians used to take comfort from universal traces of what they thought were natural apprehensions of the divine, however distorted, but religion is not a natural given of that sort. He stresses that it is passed on by socialization from parent to child. His view, which he emphasizes, is that religion varies in its form and intensity, and in its absence and presence, because of specifiable historical and social conditions. It's the differences that matter. He says boldly, the conclusion has to be that religion is a cultural product. He draws empirical conclusions from this, in particular in connection with secularization theory, with which you may be familiar. Although he has independent reasons for questioning the latter, he doesn't believe it can be criticized because of the natural resilience of religion or on grounds of an instinct for religion. You might question the use of the term instinct in this context, but the thrust of his argument is clear. Since the 1960s, and this is what secularization is about, many sociologists have predicted the progressive demise of religious influence in the face of what they term secularization, fueled by an ever-increasing respect for scientific rationality, particularly then for empirical science, which it's alleged has no respect or room for religion. That itself is questionable, but that's the topic of another lecture. The plight of religion, indeed, in Western Europe could seem to bear that out. But the resurgence and persistence of religion elsewhere seems a blatant contradiction to the thesis. Religion is resurgent in most parts of the world, not Western Europe, not Germany, not England, but certainly in many parts of the world it's religion that is influential. Might one explanation be then that secularization, involving the banishment of religion to the private sphere, religion has no place in the public marketplace, involving elimination of religion, actually does go against the grain of human nature. Religion can be put down, but it will always flourish again. Secularization might be a process for a time. It is unlikely to succeed for any significant period. Now, Martin denies all that. He will look to other social explanations. For instance, he writes, while supporters of a strong secularization theory are waiting for the predicted disappearance of religion in the United States of America and Poland, cognitive scientists, supposing they know anything at all about empirical evidence, are waiting for its predicted reappearance in the former DDR, East Germany, Estonia, and the Czech Republic. Well, what happens in Europe is very patchy, but he is saying that secularization is the explanation in some places anyway. But that isn't the norm. Martin comments that thus far the secularization theorists have the empirical advantage. You can argue about that. He would make much, say, of the religious differences between the Czech Republic and neighbouring Slovakia, but suggest that only social, only historical reasons can explain the difference. their common humanity cannot. Now, one problem with words like secularization, globalization, these grand sociological words, of which sociologists come out with, and it all sounds very impressive, is that they suggest remorseless, mechanistic processes in society that we can do nothing about, that we're carried along on a wave of secularization. Humans are unaware of them, they can't control them. And they appear to give the means to social scientists to make empirical predictions, as Martin himself has suggested. Yet I think, well, you might say as a philosopher I would say this, I think this is to let sociology overreach itself. The reification of such processes, making it appear that they have a life of their own, is a dangerous mistake. It can make sociology appear more scientific, but it can undercut the basic truth about all human societies, that they are human. They reflect the desires, the needs, the interests of humans, not just Russians, British, Americans. We're human, and that matters. We are not just set in an already constructed social world which exists apart from human beings. It is true, we're each individually born and inducted into a society produced by previous generations. It's true that the cumulative effect of countless individual actions can produce social contexts which are unintended, nobody wants, but nevertheless they're there, and they can be harmful to human interests. Society can get out of control. But at root, they were produced by humans, individual humans. Ultimately, they can be controlled by humans. The social world is not like the physical world, acting as an external, sometimes unalterable constraint on us all. Just because the social world is human in origin, its nature reflects what humans are like. Now, no one doubts that sociology can identify trends, it can identify significant tendencies in human behaviour, it can show that Western Europe is more secular compared with, for instance, what's happening in other parts of the world. It can show that Canada is more secular than the United States. But it can show, for instance, whether there's a correlation between the degree of scientific advance and reduced profile of religious influence. It can certainly try to explain cultural and religious difference, but it seems less able to account for the apparent universality of dispositions to religious belief in the first place. The absence of religion of any kind in a society for more than a short time would seem very remarkable. It certainly does not seem typical of human experience through time. The issue in question here is not the truth of religion. That's a different issue, an important issue. And different religions can make different claims, and not all can be true. The fact that there are so many different religions with so many diverse claims shows that. All religion could be false. That is not the issue, which is simply the fact of universality. David Martin, like many, believes that the presence or absence of religion is due to social, not biological factors. The differences between religions seem to be in such need of explanation that the mere fact, if it is one, of the religiosity of human beings is just taken for granted. Yet it would be very remarkable that in diverse places and times, through all human history, human beings have constructed communal systems of belief and ritual which have been passed on through the generations, and I would say are recognizably similar. It's remarkable that these recognizably similar patterns of reactions to the world seem to just rise independently in many different kinds of societies. It's also remarkable that these appear to be so easily transmitted from one generation to another. The human mind seems deeply receptive to certain ways of looking at the world, and I would argue that that is particularly true of religious views. Now, a concentration on cultural diversity, let alone specifically religious diversity, leads quickly to a concentration on the environmental influences on human beings, which can be many and various. We've already seen this. And it will be hardly surprising that human behaviour differs very much in time and place. Inputs determine outputs, and then any intervening connection between the two can often be ignored as irrelevant to any explanation. That was the programme of the behaviourists, who thought of inputs and outputs, and everything in between was a black box they could ignore. The black box was just inaccessible. The contents were irrelevant for their studies if they existed at all. Now, that type of reasoning inevitably leads to a downgrading of the idea of human nature. What or who we are is determined by our environment, or more specifically, our society. And our actions seem to be then the product of that. We're back with the same argument. And the idea of a shared common humanity quickly drops out as irrelevant. Yet if everything is socially constructed, including our own identities, our own characters, our needs and interests as humans, there are consequences, and they're important. We're imprisoned within the different worlds that are socially constructed. You in your world, I in mine. By definition, one world will not be related to another. There is no common reality in which we're all placed, because our beliefs about that reality will have been determined by the society that's produced us. There will be assumed to be no common reaction to our common environments, or our different environments even. Our shared humanity is not then by definition a resource. So you're locked in a Russian world, I'm locked in an English world. You can't understand me even if my words couldn't be properly translated. We're all just totally out of contact with each other. That isn't true, we're all human. Human languages can be translated, we can communicate with each other to a greater or lesser extent. So I'm arguing against relativism. This brings us to the relativism that's all too common nowadays, which sees people as sealed in separate social compartments, each with their own separate conceptual schemes and ways of thought. And the philosophical consequences of that are massive, because without the concept of an objective reality in which we're all placed, we lose the idea of common, shared reactions to it, which we can all share. There isn't a common reality, there's a socially constructed reality. Your social reality, my social reality. There isn't a common humanity. There's your kind of humanity, my kind of humanity. There isn't a humanity as such. There will then be no way in which mutual understanding between people of different cultures and religions is even theoretically possible. There's no common ground. We can't all be here from different places communicating. In fact, the fact we are here and I hope can communicate will show that relativism is wrong. Otherwise, there would be no way in which bridges can be built between people. We would be sealed in mutually exclusive, socially constructed worlds. When difference and diversity is stressed too much, there comes a point at which there is no commonality left. All basis for mutual comprehension is removed. Indeed, the possibility of translation between the languages of different worlds is removed. Even if we could understand what the languages conveyed, there's little chance that we could find the people using the motivations and interests of those using them. By definition, as the creatures of a socially constructed world which is different, their beliefs and practices would be beyond our understanding. Now that is all a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to absurdity, of the relativist position. But its main features often occur in a variety of philosophical positions. The minute that translation and mutual understanding becomes difficult between forms of life, as in the later Wittgenstein, or incommensurability between paradigms is taken for granted, as in the work of Thomas Kuhn in the History and Philosophy of Science, we're losing grip on the idea of an objective reality to which we all cultures have equal access. We equally have lost the idea of a common human nature which all share, so that our reactions to the same world will then take broadly similar forms and be recognizable across cultures. Now, in recent years, a radical overthrow of the idea of a common rationality, linking and underpinning different traditions, has led to the repudiation of many of the principles of the so-called Enlightenment, reason, truth. So-called postmodernism takes the same route as earlier forms of relativism, against an overarching reason, against an objective reality. It locks concepts into particular traditions, linked to time and place. And that has to be the result, in other words, if we make the whole concept of, and makes the whole concept of human rights problematic. If our humanity is constituted by a local tradition, that means, again, there's no such thing as human nature, so there can't be human rights, because human rights imply there's something called humanity. Each culture has to set its own standards, and the idea of appealing to an abstract humanity that is left with no content is pointless. That is the danger of so-called multiculturalism and of references to pluralism. Both offer little more than the banal observation that there's great diversity in the human worlds, and we do not all agree. That is a sociological observation, however, that can be built up into a dangerous philosophical principle that there is no underlying communality behind the apparent diversity. Then the diversity is all there is. So we find postmodernist philosophers agreeing with the sociologists. Diversity is where we start. Words like multiculturalism then can develop into a full-fledged relativism, according to which there are no external benchmarks beyond those posited by different cultures. Now, ideas referring to humanity, like human rights, then become seen as the posturing by particular cultures. Indeed, some people say human rights just are a kind of the projection of Western values or something like that. But the allegation is that they just use schemes of thought peculiar to themselves that have no general application. That is the criticism levelled by some against what is seen, as I've said, particularly as Western attitudes. They have no general application to all human beings. The idea of humans then becomes virtually an empty concept, or at least a contested one. One political theorist based in Britain of Asian origin, Bhikkhu Parekh, points out, since human beings lead organised lives as their nature has been profoundly shaped by layers of social influences, we have no access to it in its raw form and cannot easily separate what is natural from what is social. Again, the natural is reduced to the social. There may be a difficulty, but this is being transformed into a philosophical principle so that what is social in all its variety becomes primary. The natural recedes into becoming a something we know not what, which can be easily forgotten and which plays no role in our understanding. Yet that must be wrong, since, as we've already seen, communication between different languages, different cultures, theories, conceptual schemes or whatever, depends on access to some commonality shared by all. Parekh advocates an intercultural dialogue, which enables, he says, each cultural community to look at its beliefs and practices from the standpoints of others. But the question is, what has to be the case for that dialogue to take place? If we're all locked in distinct and separate communities, it will be impossible. If, on the other hand, we all possess a common human nature with shared interests, desires, common human reactions, then other beliefs and practices, however apparently alien, will still be intelligible to us. We may find them strange, but we can understand them. And that particularly applies in the sphere of religion. It is in this context of an encroaching relativism which threatens our understanding of others, so that we don't see them as human beings, much like ourselves, that modern scientific work becomes of great importance. It shows us not just how we, whoever we are, as citizens of particular time and place are constituted. It tells us how we, as human beings, are likely to react to the world. It informs us how humans naturally think and what their basic tendencies, dispositions, and desires are. The practice of science itself aspires to universality. It tells us not just what is true in London, Moscow, or Washington, or St. Petersburg, but what is everywhere the case. In the case of research into human beings, it aspires to tell us how humans are liable to think and act, not just how Americans or Russians do. Relativism leads to the death of all science. Science becomes reduced to the cultural expression of one science in one place. I'm referring particularly to empirical science, but it applies, of course, to all forms of human knowledge. The pejorative term Western science is often used to suggest it doesn't apply everywhere. And the very same skepticism which undermines any possibility of referring to human rights also renders science impotent and reduces human rationality to just a series of local prejudices. Now, the cognitive science of religion, which I mentioned at the beginning, claims to be truly scientific, but it's going then to aspire to universality. It's based on empirical evidence gained through proper scientific method, particularly in the fields of psychology and anthropology. It conducts cross-cultural research, and its findings are intended to apply across cultures. It isn't just true within one culture. It isn't just the expression of one culture. The conclusions to be drawn from it are going to concern human beings as such, not just the members of a particular society. The assumption must be that we can identify a similar cluster of typical and similar human reactions to their environment that can be called religious in different social contexts across time. There's a commonality behind the diversity. There's a content to being human, the inclination to take up definite patterns of beliefs, practices, and rituals, so that that's central to the human condition. Now, let's take one example in the area. It's fascinating to see how children naturally develop a theory of mind. At first, young children of about 3 find it difficult to realise that their mother doesn't know everything. The mother may not even know what the child themselves knows. And typically, between the ages of 3 and about 4, they can come to understand that different people have different perspectives. Those may be limited. Now, if you put an apple between one of 2 or 3 dishes while the mother is watching, the mother goes out of the room, and you then take the apple and put it under another dish. The child knows where the apple now is, but the mother doesn't. But the child, at 3, thinks mummy knows everything. At 4, and I've done this with my own grandchildren, so it works, children of 4 or so will know different. And they will understand that mummy can't know what's happened if she didn't see it happen. Well, so far so good. But an interesting facet of this is that if children are then questioned about God, and asked if God knows where the apple is, they typically, even at the age of 4, find no difficulty in assuming he will know. God knows everything, one would say. Another child said simply, God is God. Let me just add in parenthesis there, this doesn't in fact just show that children have been brought up in a certain way. It's what they find it easy to believe. They find it easy to go on believing that God knows everything, even when they find Mummy doesn't. So it's what's easy to believe, not just what they've been taught. You can teach a child some things about quantum mechanics, they won't find that easy at all. Now, this tale of false belief tasks can be replicated in many similar experiments. But an immediate response is that it shows something about the child's upbringing, as I was just saying. It will be said a child will have clearly been taught about who God is, so as to be able to use the concept in the first place. The sociologist will claim that so-called natural reactions are just clearly culturally conditioned. Yet it's significant that similar studies can be conducted in different cultures with similar results. Nicola Knight, who worked with me in our Oxford project, found that children in different cultures with different understandings about non-natural entities were still able, easily, to develop nuanced distinctions of their ability to know. He says, they don't appear to use humans as a basis to reason about God, and they were also able to distinguish in South America between humans and the classical Maya divinities. Again, it's what they found it easy to think, not just what they've been taught. So the issue isn't that children can have a ready packaged concept of the Christian God without any teaching. Ideas that our thinking can be hardwired in that way, so that they're totally detached from environmental influences, are wide of the mark. No child is born hardwired to speak English or Russian. They aren't born speaking that on the day of birth. Language learning, even so, has everything to do with capabilities that are part of human nature. Your dog won't learn Russian. So if that weren't the case, there would have been much more success in getting the higher apes to communicate linguistically. Propensities and capabilities go to constitute what it is to be human. Mentally, we're inclined to notice some things rather than others. The human mind is already tilted towards finding some things salient and other things not. We find it easier to think in some ways than others, and we're naturally able to grasp some concepts more easily than others. Now, the cognitive science of religion that I'm talking about charts these dispositions and tendencies, and experiments that show how easily children can attribute super knowledge to non-natural entities. They find it easy to refer to God as knowing everything, shows something about how children's minds develop. Many, including philosophers, have assumed that all our reasoning about agents proceeds by analogy with our experience of human beings. We go from us to them. We just think anthropomorphically. But these experiments suggest, perhaps, that thinking about God and other spiritual agents can part company with beliefs about human capabilities. People can begin to understand that gods are different. When they understand what humans are like, they still go on thinking certain things about God. We start with certain natural assumptions about knowledge and soon find that humans do not measure up. Children do, though, find it obvious that God and other agents still can meet our initial expectations. Now, as I said, the issue is what humans find it easy to conceive, the stories they can grasp best, the stories that they can remember, even the religious doctrines that resonate best with our initial conceptual scheme. And the cognitive science of religion shows not only why individuals may find it easy to hold on to certain beliefs, but why certain conceptual patterns are readily grasped and transmitted, particularly when, as the jargon puts it, they are minimally counterintuitive. They go a little bit against our normal expectations, but not too much. We are gripped by something that is out of the ordinary, such as in another context, talking frogs in a fairy story. A frog that talks is unusual, but not so far away from our comprehension that we do not grasp the idea and find it easy to remember, precisely because it is unusual. Disembodied agents that are like us but not with bodies, are easy for us to latch onto. Empirical research demonstrates that concepts that are in this way slightly against our intuitions are easier to remember than just ordinary, everyday ones. That's why fairy stories can grip our imagination. But complex ideas that are too far away from our ordinary, everyday intuitions become progressively harder to lay hold of. Talking frogs are memorable, just as persons without bodies may be. But a pink elephant that flies through the air, goes through solid walls, and then becomes a pineapple before breaking into song is just too much to grasp. So the issue is not just why people are religious, but why religions, both beliefs and practices, can be passed on through generations. How do children learn? Why do they remember? There must be something in the human mind that inclines it to think in ways that are receptive to religion, and to be able to grasp them when communicated. As we've seen, this must also be true on a cross-cultural basis. We're not locked up in our own individual cultures, but the way in which we all share the same form of what I've termed basic cognitive architecture means that humans can easily understand each other across what might appear unbridgeable caverns of space and time. Human minds work in the same way, simply, as I've said, because they are human. We can all easily grasp the idea of someone knowing everything, just as other ideas that go to build up characteristic religious attitudes are easily grasped, understood, and communicated. The cognitive science of religion shows how we can all understand the idea of non-physical agency, the idea of mind existing apart from body, life after death. We're intuitive dualists, in other words, we can think of the mind apart from the body. Some accounts of so-called near-death experiences tell of people seeming to have the experience of being detached from their body and looking down on it, perhaps as doctors attempt resuscitation. Perhaps you've read of these things. Now, the point isn't what we should make of such accounts, that's a long story, but they're easy to imagine. I can even imagine myself looking down on my body being worked on by doctors. Strange, but you can imagine it. We can imagine being out of our body. So it's what we find it easy to think of. We can think of being apart from our body. Now, some would dismiss all this as folk psychology that we must discard as we acquire scientific knowledge. But the point is that this is how we find it easy to think, that's how the human mind works, and scientific explanations that appear to contradict our everyday notions are much more difficult to grasp. Who knows quite what we understand about quantum mechanics? In the same way, it's said that we naturally indulge in promiscuous teleology about purpose, seeing purpose everywhere. We are naturally prone to see purpose rather than just mechanical explanation. We look for purpose rather than just accept explanations in terms of cause and effect. When a tragic accident happens, we want to know why. The cry, "Why should this happen to me? Why?" is a normal human reaction, even if no answer appears forthcoming. And that's no doubt why theories about evolution that subtract purpose from the scheme of things, that talk only of chance, appear so difficult to accept. True or not, we are already, as humans, biased against them. And experiments have shown how, under pressure to give quick answers, even well-trained scientists will plump for an explanation in terms of purpose, rather than a strictly scientific one in terms of causation. And that there are well-documented experiments showing this, that our normal reaction, one we plump for quickly, is why something happens. Children certainly prefer to see purpose. When they're asked to say, why are some rocks pointed? They won't give causal explanations about erosion or whatever. There's something of the order of, It's so that birds can't sit on them. In this way, the cognitive science of religion shows how different biases and dispositions in the way we think go to build up what can be seen as characteristically religious pictures of the world, in terms of disembodied agency, life after death, purpose, and so on. Now, three charges will immediately be laid at this picture. Why should we be guided by what are admitted to be infantile understandings? Even if they're natural, what does that prove, since that all our natural tendencies are good? And third, even if we do have unthinking beliefs growing out of what we've termed human cognitive architecture, that doesn't show that they're reliable, let alone true. Now, all these objections invite us to ignore the fact that, and just a simple fact, that we as humans have these certain natural reactions. That is the basic point. This is the starting point. Instead, all of these charges go on to criticize them as guides to action. And as I've said, this is to miss an important point. The issue should not be whether such reactions are true. Certainly the facts we naturally have them proves little of their worth, I'll admit that. There are many normal human reactions, such as disgust at the sight of blood, that it may be important for some to overcome, if, for instance, somebody wants to practice surgery. But they may be useful in some contexts and have developed for evolutionary reasons. But as I've said, that doesn't mean they're always good guides. In any case, it's far from clear, or certainly that the existence of different religions tends to suggest that basic human reactions, including inclinations to conceive of non-natural agents, certainly it shows that they underdetermine the kind of religion that we might adopt. So that cognitive science religion doesn't say, therefore Christianity, or therefore Islam. It's just religion, which is a very, very basic substructure on which something has to be built. There seem to be desires and tendencies built into human nature which can be manifested in many different ways. That's our starting point, we were talking about that. But we may be biased at a fundamental level to populate reality with more entities than we can see and touch. We may want to see events as basically having a purpose. We may think that this life is not all that there is. None of this, however, leads firmly in the direction of one religion rather than another. Indeed, it may not even point very firmly to any idea of monotheism. Some religions posit many gods. But there seems to be a lot of space left to be filled by a variety of different types of religion, all answering the basic slant of human cognition. One theological response from a Christian point of view might be that this demonstrates the necessity for special revelation, because we know very little about the nature of ultimate reality. Yet, it might have prepared the ground for it. So a human mind, totally devoid of preconceptions, the archetypal blank slate, in Latin tabula rasa, sheet of white paper on which nothing's written, or those images, there, if you think of the human mind like that, you're very unlikely to be able to recognize divine revelation as such. Only those with, as it were, minds prepared, because they find certain things salient, might be prepared to recognize revelation for what it is, assuming it were genuine. Now, some might portray that as saying that in every human heart there is a God-shaped slot waiting to be filled, seeing this as part of the Creator's purpose. And its arguments like those, when balanced against the views of atheists like Dawkins, who think that reason can show us the infantile and baseless nature of our reactions, that might suggest that the cognitive science of religion does nothing to settle the argument about whether our natural religious tendencies can or cannot be justified. The findings of cognitive science appear neutral in the debate between theists and atheists. On the one side, the ground is prepared for religion, on the other, people would say it's all infantile, discard it. But they all accept those reactions, those instincts, those preconditions are there. So, All this illustrates a general truth about the character of the inchoate quasi-religious reaction to the world which the cognitive science of religion exposes. All these reactions need considerable elaboration by what at the extreme becomes a body of doctrine passed through the generations, and they invite more rational reflection on their nature. Theology is one mode of such reflection. Atheism is another. So you have religion and then atheism, theology. But they're each reflecting on the character of the basic predispositions. The methods of science then, particularly empirical methods, are a product of human reasoning about reactions and at a different intellectual level from basic human cognitive reactions. We can perhaps give some rational grounding and validation for our impulses, or equally suggest that they're characteristically unreliable. Both involve the exercise of reason. Both have to take for granted the fact, and it is a fact, of our initial reactions. Religion, then, of a rather unformed kind, is the default option. We are not natural atheists, with theologians coming along to impose some alien pattern of thought on us. We do not even interpret the world in a neutral way. Our uninformed reactions to the world are much less sceptical, much more predisposed to religion of some kind or another. They're inclined to, as I've said, to entertain minds apart from bodies, post-mortem survival, disembodied agency, and so on. Our minds, as I've said, find it easy to grasp what is minimally counterintuitive. Something out of the ordinary grabs our attention quite naturally, as long as it is not too much removed from human experience. For this reason, as the psychologist Justin Barrett, a colleague of mine at Oxford, has said, belief in gods is common precisely because such beliefs resonate with and receive support from a large number of mental tools. Out of the potentially bewildering array of data flung at us, we have to make sense of it, so that we each can conduct our lives in the environment presented to us. There are different levels of mental activity. First, we have natural reactions which occur without any process of conscious reasoning. These are typically human traits, not constructed by specific cultures. We can hear a rustling in the trees and immediately assume an agent, perhaps an animal or a spirit, has caused it. And that's why people think of disembodied agency, perhaps. We hear a house noise at night, and we might immediately think that there's somebody moving around. If we can't see anybody, we might think there's a ghost or a spirit. And this can be explained in different cultures by different sets of doctrines and beliefs, explaining perhaps what the nature of that spirit might be. We can have the illusion of total diversity, but the cognitive architecture supporting them is the same. Yet above all this, we still have the capacity as humans to indulge in rational reflection and have meta-beliefs, beliefs about our beliefs. And that is where empirical science and philosophical and religious systems themselves come in. Even the cognitive science of religion itself is an attempt to explain rationally the universality of similar systems of belief in the supernatural. Rational reflection on the nature and the possible reliability of beliefs that come naturally to us is itself a normal human activity. So we have our natural dispositions and then rational reflection, empirical science, theology, philosophy, etc. So, human beings can think rationally about what might be true. If this is denied, the physical sciences themselves are undermined as a rational activity, and the cognitive science of religion itself loses any pretension to be taken seriously along with all science. Part of the raw material of the rational reflection has to be our nature as human beings, our capabilities and potentialities. And that brings us back to the question of our raw religious reactions to the world. They are both there as part of our nature. I've emphasized this again and again. And they invite rational reflection on how significant they are, or whether they're infantile reactions which we should grow out of. It's important to separate out these levels. But many are in such a hurry to attack or defend religion that they ignore the basic facts that stares us in the face. Religion is here, universally, as a product of human nature. I'm emphasizing this again and again. It's irrelevant whether it was originally a byproduct of other cognitive mechanisms or something that was always going to be of particular significance. Because of its universality, the way in which it concerns much of what humans deem most important in life, it is going to be a force reckoned with in any society as a constant presence in some form or other. It should not and cannot in practice be forced to the margins of public life. So here we come to matters of particular political importance. It is almost part of received wisdom in some quarters that faith, so-called, is a purely subjective matter. It's about me, not the world. Impervious to reason, even probably irrational. The consequence of this is that it assumes that it can offer no contribution to the public sphere, let alone provide any reasons for the grounding of law, for instance. It's seen as the antithesis of empirical science, with the latter's appeal to shared, or apparently shared, public standards of proof and evidence. Now this split between faith and reason is a highly contentious position in the philosophy of religion that itself demands public debate. Many, and I would be one, would see a much more robust connection between faith and reason. They would not wish to restrict the idea of reason to excessively narrow ideas of what constitutes scientific proof or evidence. They would not, as I've said, see them as defined by physical evidence, physical science. Yet the contrast between private faith, subjective faith, public reason, objective reality, subjective reaction, truth, is all too often assumed without discussion. It's suggested, and this is particularly true in Western Europe, that faith is not only impervious to reason and to be contrasted with it, it is actually irrational, maybe even divisive and dangerous. And if it were not susceptible to rational challenge, that indeed might be so. And this goes with an attitude of secularization, that the secular is dealing with what's public, religion is to be pushed aside to private. Yet one implication of making faith subjective in this way is that it appears idiosyncratic and perhaps even a minority concern. It appears highly optional and something most people may have nothing to do with. As such, freedom seems to lie in making the choice to have or not have faith, something important for me, whatever it might be. It's a marginal matter which can be safely ignored in the conduct of business in the public sphere. Religion then seems to be far from pervasive, and its roots in human nature are ignored. Reason is made public and faith private. Religion in all its diversity can then be made irrelevant by definition to our common concerns. Now some may wish to retort that religion as such is a human good and ought to be encouraged in society. Well, an immediate response might be that's certainly not true of all religion. There can be pathologies of religion whereby religious impulses can be warped and twisted so that practices, even mass suicide, can be encouraged. They're certainly not conducive by any standard to the common good or to human flourishing. Yet, I would argue that because religious impulses are in human nature and cannot be ignored, they and their outcome should in fact be examined in public. all religions should be susceptible to public examination and to rational discussion in the public sphere. Otherwise, they will be left to fester without being confronted. That is extremely important. If religion is only private, it can never be challenged, let alone defended. Well, what grounds might there be for suggesting that religion has anything to do with human flourishing, or can be called a human good? How are human goods to be determined? Now clearly this must go back to issues concerning human nature and our basic desires and the needs that arise from them. Other things being equal, thwarting them should be deleterious. If we as humans see the world in a certain way naturally, other things being equal, that should be encouraged. Depriving people of food and drink cannot help them to flourish. Needs and wants are not easily split from our basic human nature. They constitute it. What it is for humans to flourish can only be understood by paying attention to our common character as human beings and the drives and impulses that define humanity. If that is so, the fact that human cognition so consistently leads humans to see the world from a religious point of view has to be significant in politics, in law, in society, everywhere. Religious viewpoints, however diverse, spring, as I've said, from the same human cognitive roots. Despite what David Martin and other sociologists have maintained, the absence of religion in a society should be far more an occasion for surprise than its presence. We do not start from a position of cognitive neutrality, waiting to soak up whatever our environment produces. That is not to say that any particular religion, or religion in general, can be necessarily justified from an intellectual point of view. As I keep on saying, that's a separate argument. The important point is that somehow, at the heart of human life, religion, religious impulses are there. And anyone who assumes that such religion can be just ignored as a basic force, a crucial force very often in human society, is deeply mistaken. They're going against the grain of human nature. So the characteristic impulses to religion, its building blocks, may certainly be channeled in different directions. It's the function of human rationality to engage with the question how good particular religions are, whether they do add to human flourishing, let alone whether they're claiming anything that could be true. There would be something wrong, even from a theological point of view, with a religious practice such as the literal human sacrifice on the altar of some religion that unquestionably increased the sum of human suffering. The theologies giving rise to such practices must be suspect. Arguments about the contribution religions make to human good and harm are a part of the stuff of controversy of modern public life. And they cannot be shirked by pretending that faith is just personal, just a private matter of no public concern. The secular world can go on ignoring them. The fact that religion is always present and deeply rooted in our nature means that driving it underground will always produce pressure points. In the end, it just cannot be ignored. Yet a more fundamental issue remains. While the blanket term religion, and it's always difficult to define religion, covers a multitude of different beliefs and practices, all of which are the fruit of basic human responses to the world, we mustn't become so obsessed with arguing about this or that manifestation of religion and the benefits and harms that might ensue that we do forget a basic truth. If humans typically want something, then other things being equal, it is good that they have it. Food, drink, shelter. People immediately seize on the implied conditions, but the assumption must be that their desires should not be thwarted without good reason. So there should be a presupposition that people can manifest their religion, I would argue. The default position should be that people can be free to try to get what they want. Without desires, without the freedom to implement them, human busy beings are paralyzed. Reason can modify desires, control them, restrain them. But if we don't have any, we're going to cease to be agents. So cognitive science demonstrates that many typical human responses, both desires and initial beliefs, are cross-cultural. They develop naturally in children. We can't pretend they're not there, or that they do not at a pre-reflective level lead us to react to our environment in particular ways. These are conducive to characteristic religious beliefs, such as a belief in supernatural agency or non-physical entities, the ghost that's moving something upstairs. Those who wish to restrain such impulses are making a judgment, which may or may not be justified about a basic element in our common nature, but whether it ought to be indulged or controlled has to be the subject of informed public debate. Individuals with individual freedom and issues about that then inevitably arise. Is the state or any other authority to tell me that some of my most basic desires are misplaced? Might this not be in a free society a decision that is properly left to the individual, perhaps after rational discussion with others? And so fundamentally the issue is one of individual liberty. If I want a drink or some food, that is a reason for my having it. Other people should not deny it to me without very good reasons that must be themselves be susceptible to public examination. And religious impulses are not the chance creation of particular kinds of societies present in some and absent in others. They're not the chance choice of a few individuals, not just a matter of private idiosyncrasy. The cognitive science of religion is making the bold empirical claim that they're the starting point for everyone. Everyone finds it easy to latch onto religious concepts, even Richard Dawkins. They're an integral part of the very way we've come to think. What constitutes human flourishing can only be decided with reference to human nature. And that in turn makes reference to our wants and needs inevitable. The freedom to be what we wish to be has to be fundamental in any society that claims to be free. Reason may not be the slave of the passions, as the philosopher David Hume maintained, but our basic human reactions certainly give us the raw material with which to fashion our lives. Empirical science in general, cognitive science in particular, gives us an enlarged understanding of what that material is. It underlies all societies. Some societies go with the grain of human nature, some go against. Probably at a cost, probably not for a long period. I would add that therefore an atheist society is not likely to last for very long. Human well-being and fulfillment are intrinsically linked to our ingrained nature. Human rights in general acknowledge the fact that humanity is not at root socially constructed. Similarly, the particular right to religious freedom answers the universal fact we seek some larger spiritual reality. We impute purpose to even apparently random events. Even a rational atheism, and of course there can be such, is a considered attempt to deal with an issue that would not arise unless there was an inbuilt bias to believe in the opposite. The right to religious freedom, both to believe and to manifest that belief, is a recognition of the fact that we all, as human beings, have to come to terms with that nature and decide whether to follow and fulfill it or to control and restrain it. After all, such freedom includes the freedom to deny all purported religious truth as well as to assert it. What the right to religious freedom does recognise is that this is a fundamental issue for all humanity. Religion is there, the issue of freedom is there. It's not going to disappear, whatever the apostles of secularization might believe. So the argument that the public square be neutral and that religion has no place in it is one argument that's increasingly popular in Western Europe, and one symptom is the desire to drive all religious symbolism, such as crosses or religious dress, Islamic veils and so on, out of the public view. And that chimes in with traditional ideas stemming from the later Enlightenment, particularly in France, that religion is harmful and intrinsically opposed to human liberty and reason. Yet religion is not so easily driven from public view, and as I've argued, it's anyway healthier if it's publicly confronted and discussed. If a religion itself claims truth, it should never be afraid itself of the light of reason. A light that those involved in the early English Enlightenment of the 17th century associated with illumination from God. In the 17th century, even philosophers like John Locke referred to reason as the candle of the Lord. Cognitive science has uncovered some of the basic impulses at work in the mind. Let us hope that as we all understand ourselves better, we are readier to allow others the freedom to live as they feel they ought. Thank you very much.